Stop, the Apache girl whispered. The rancher misread, and that night changed everything. John Miller had lived all his life on the wide, dusty plains of Arizona. The sun rose and set over his ranch in the same slow, predictable way it had for decades. The land stretched endlessly, dotted with sagebrush, cacti, and the occasional lone tree. It was beautiful in a quiet way, but it could be harsh. The wind swept across the plains with a force that could push against a man and make him feel small. John was a man used to hard work and long days. He was not a man who welcomed surprises. He preferred the routine of life he had built with his own hands, the early mornings feeding the cattle, the afternoons repairing fences, and the evenings sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun sink below the horizon. He liked the silence, the simplicity, and the sense of control that came with knowing what each day would bring. John had always lived alone. His wife had passed many years ago, and he had no children to carry on his name. The ranch was everything to him. It was not just land. It was a life he had carved out, a place where he knew every rock, every tree, and every fence post. The cattle knew him too. Breas. They would come when he whistled, and they trusted him to keep them safe. Life was predictable, and John liked it that way. But deep down, he also carried a quiet loneliness. The kind that comes not from needing company, but from realizing that life can pass by quietly if you never let it surprise you. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of orange and the wind carried the scent of rain, John noticed something unusual near the edge of his property. A small figure was moving slowly, almost cautiously, through the tall grass. At first, he thought it might be one of the neighbor's children, or perhaps a lost traveler. But as he squinted, he realized it was a young girl, alone and walking as if she was searching for something, or running from something. Her clothes were simple, worn from travel, and her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders. She looked tired, her small frame moving with a mixture of fear and determination. John felt a strange mix of curiosity and concern. He had always believed in minding his own business, especially in a land where danger could come from any direction. But something about this girl made him pause. She didn't seem dangerous, only lost. Something in her eyes, a mix of fear and trust, made him hesitate before turning back to his chores. He watched as she approached a small cluster of trees near the edge of the property. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying the distant sound of cattle lowing and the occasional hoot of an owl. As night began to fall, the girl disappeared from sight. John tried to focus on his work, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. The air was cooler now, and the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping lightly on the roof of the barn. He had learned to read the signs of the weather over the years, and he knew a storm was coming. The clouds rolled in, dark and heavy, casting long shadows across the land. John's routine life, so predictable and safe, suddenly felt fragile. The storm would make travel dangerous, especially for someone so small and alone. By the time the storm was near, John had decided he could not ignore her. Leaving the barn, he walked toward where he had last seen her. The wind whipped his coat around him, and the rain soaked through to his skin, but he pressed on. There, huddled beneath a low tree, was the girl. She looked up at him with wide eyes, her small hands clasped together as if in prayer. Bert. Her lips trembled, and she shivered in the cold rain. John called out softly, "Hey, are you all right?" She didn't answer, only looked at him with fear and hesitation. He knelt a short distance away and spoke gently. "You're safe. Come with me. You don't have to stay out here in this storm." After a long pause, she nodded slowly and began to walk toward him. John led her back to his barn, keeping his voice low and calm so as not to frighten her further. Inside, the barn was warm compared to the cold, wet night outside. The smell of hay, mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke. John offered her a blanket and a place to sit. She hesitated, then accepted, wrapping the blanket tightly around her small frame. As she sat there, John noticed how carefully she observed everything around her. There was a quiet intelligence in her eyes, a cautiousness born from experience. She did not speak much, only nodding or shaking her head in response to his questions. John tried to make her comfortable, offering her some food and water, but she was wary of both. He realized that she had probably been on her own for a long time. He had not expected to find anyone like her on his property, and now that he had, he felt an unfamiliar responsibility settle on his shoulders. The storm outside grew stronger, and the wind rattled the barn's wooden walls. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by the deep rumble of thunder. The girl flinched at every sound, holding the blanket tighter around her. John understood that fear. He had felt it many times in his life, though for different reasons. He tried to speak softly, telling her stories of the land, of his life on the ranch, and of the cattle he cared for so much. Slowly she began to relax, listening to his calm voice as if the words themselves were a shield against the storm. Hours passed, and the rain did not let up. The barn, normally a place of work and solitude, became a refuge. John found himself watching the girl, wondering how she had come to be alone on this land. He had heard stories from the neighbors about conflicts between settlers and the local Apache communities, but he had never been directly involved. Desperately seeing her now, he felt the weight of history and culture pressing silently into the barn alongside the storm. There was a fragility in her presence, a reminder of how easily life could be disrupted by forces beyond one's control. By midnight, the storm had reached its peak. The girl's eyes were heavy with sleep, but she did not move. John realized that she was exhausted, and he wanted to make her feel safe. He left her with a small lantern and went to check the cattle in the nearby pen, ensuring they were sheltered from the rain. When he returned, she had moved slightly closer to the fire he had built in a small metal stove. Her breathing was slow, almost peaceful now, and John felt a sense of relief. He had not expected to find anyone that night, and yet here she was, under his roof, trusting him in a way he had rarely experienced in his own life. Sitting across from her, John thought about the strange twists of life that could bring two people from completely different worlds together. He reflected on his own life, filled with routine and certainty, realized that the arrival of this girl had introduced something new. A chance to care for someone in need, to protect someone vulnerable, and perhaps, in a small way, to connect with a world he had only observed from a distance. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, but inside the barn, a quiet warmth had taken root. It was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, a night that would quietly change them both. The storm had grown stronger as the night deepened. Rain pounded the roof of the barn. The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls, and lightning flashed across the dark sky. Inside, the small lantern flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the hay and tools stacked neatly along the walls. The young girl, Maria, stayed huddled under the blanket, her dark eyes wide with fear. Every flash of lightning made her flinch, and every crack of thunder made her grip the blanket tighter. John Miller sat nearby, watching her with concern, unsure how to comfort her. He had faced many storms on the plains before, but none had felt so personal, so urgent as this one. "Don't stop," the girl whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. She trembled slightly, her small hands clutching the blanket tightly. John froze, unsure what she meant. The words made no sense to him in that moment. Was she asking him to stop talking? Stop moving! Stop the storm! Desp. He couldn't tell. He leaned closer, trying to understand, but the flickering light in the shadows made it difficult to read her expression. John's mind raced. He had grown up in these lands, and he had always been careful with people he did not understand. He had heard whispers of conflicts between settlers and Apache communities, of misunderstandings that could turn dangerous in an instant. He had been careful all his life, and now he faced a situation he could not predict. The girl's words, simple as they were, carried a weight he did not comprehend. He wanted to help her, but he feared that any wrong move could make things worse. Pshh! Wait, he said softly, his voice calm but firm. I don't understand. What do you mean? Maria shook her head, her eyes wide and filled with worry. She repeated the words, "Don't, stop," but this time she added a small gesture, pointing toward the door and then back at the storm outside. Raven. John realized she was talking about the storm itself. She wanted it to stop. The winds, the rain, the fear. It was too much for her small frame to endure. Relief washed over him for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by guilt. He had misread her before, imagining meanings that were not there. He realized how easy it was to misunderstand someone whose world was different from his own, whose language, culture, and experiences were not the same. He felt the responsibility keenly. This small, frightened girl was counting on him, and it was his duty to make her feel safe. John moved closer to her, keeping his voice low so it would not startle her.
It's all right, he said. I don't know if he said.
The storm will pass. You're safe here with me. Maria's eyes softened slightly, and she nodded, though her body still trembled. She buried her face in the blanket, trying to block out the noise and the fear. John could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of the night. He understood now that she had been running not just from the storm, but from the dangers of the world outside. The barn felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with the storm's sound. John tried to make it feel safer. He moved some hay to create a more comfortable spot near the stove where the fire crackled softly, casting warmth across the room. He offered her some bread and water, and after a long pause, she accepted. She ate slowly, her movements cautious, as if testing the trust between them. John watched quietly, giving her space while remaining close enough to intervene if needed. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. The wind slammed against the barn doors, rattling them in their frames, and rain leaked through small gaps in the roof, dripping onto the floor in irregular patterns. Maria finally lifted her head from the blanket, looking around with cautious curiosity. Her dark eyes studied the tools, the stacks of hay, and the fire. For a moment she seemed to forget the storm, captivated by the warmth and safety of the barn. John noticed her curiosity and decided to speak about his life. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle he cared for, and the routine of his days. Desket, he described the mornings when he would walk through the fields checking fences, and the evenings when the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink across the plains. His voice was calm, steady, and comforting. Maria began to relax, listening to him as she wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. It was clear she was still frightened, but she was starting to trust him, little by little. Then, without warning, a louder clap of thunder made the barn shake. Maria gasped, pulling the blanket over her head. John reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said again. "I'm here. Nothing can hurt you inside this barn." She peeked out from under the blanket, her eyes still wide, but less fearful than before. John smiled gently, realizing that patience and calmness were the only tools he had to guide her through the night. He thought about the life she must have led. She had come from a world far different from his own, a world where danger could appear without warning, and trust was earned, carefully. He wondered what had driven her to his ranch, why she had come alone into the storm. He could only imagine the hardships she had faced, and the thought filled him with a mixture of empathy and determination. He would keep her safe. no matter what. As the night wore on, the storm began to show signs of slowing. The wind's howl became less fierce, and the rain softened to a steady drizzle. John knew that the worst was over, but he also knew that the night had changed both of them. Maria had learned that there were strangers who could be kind and protective, and John had learned that the world was bigger and more complicated than his quiet ranch life had ever shown him. They spoke little after that, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. John continued to tend the small fire, adding wood carefully, while Maria rested nearby. The barn, once a place of work and routine, had become a refuge, a place of temporary safety from a world that was often unkind. For both of them, the night had become a test of patience, trust, and courage. At one point, Maria whispered again, this time almost as a thought to herself, "Don't." "Stop." John realized she was referring to the fire this time, the warmth it provided in the cold barn. He chuckled softly and assured her that the fire would keep burning. They shared a quiet moment, both understanding that survival was not just about enduring the storm outside, but also about finding comfort and trust in the midst of fear. By the time the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, the storm had passed completely. The rain left the land damp and glistening, and the air smelled fresh and clean. Birds began to sing softly, and the first rays of sunlight peeked through the barn walls. John looked at Maria, who was now sitting quietly, her dark hair damp but her eyes calmer than they had been all night. The storm had ended, but its memory lingered. Both of them knew that life had shifted in subtle ways, that something important had begun in the quiet of the barn during the long hours of darkness. John felt a sense of relief and hope. He had misread her words at first, but he had listened and learned. He realized that misunderstandings could happen easily, especially when people came from different worlds. What mattered most was patience, empathy, and the willingness to understand. Maria, too, had learned to trust, to lean on someone she had never met before, and to accept help when it was offered. The night had changed them both, in ways they did not fully understand yet, but in ways that would shape their actions and choices in the days to come. As the sun rose higher, painting the plains with gold and orange, John prepared to take care of the ranch again. Maria stayed close, watching quietly, still cautious but less fearful. The storm had passed, but the lessons it had brought, the importance of trust, patience, and understanding, remained. For both of them, the night had been a turning point, a quiet moment of growth and connection that neither would forget. The morning after the storm was calm, but the quiet carried a weight of unease. Don Miller had woken early, as was his habit, and the soft light of dawn spilled across the wet plains. The barn smelled of damp hay and rain-soaked wood. Maria was awake too, sitting quietly near the fire, her small hands folded in her lap. She looked tired, but her dark eyes were alert, watching John as he moved about the barn. Psst. She had not spoken much since the storm ended, and John realized that while she seemed safer, the night had left her cautious and wary. John tried to keep the atmosphere calm. He moved carefully, preparing breakfast and tending the fire. "Eat something," he said gently, placing a plate of bread and dried fruit near her. Maria hesitated, glancing at him before picking up a piece. She chewed slowly, as if testing whether the food was safe. John watched quietly, remembering how careful he had been when he first arrived in this world of responsibility and trust. He realized that this girl had been through hardships that he could hardly imagine. She had survived alone in a world that could be unforgiving, and he could only begin to understand her struggles. After breakfast, John suggested that she rest a little more while he worked on the ranch. Maria nodded but remained close, following his movements with a cautious curiosity. Hey. As John stepped outside, he felt the cool morning air on his face. The storm had left puddles across the fields, and the earth smelled fresh and alive. but the calm beauty of the morning was deceptive. John could feel tension lingering in the barn and in the girl's posture. She had survived the storm physically, but the emotional impact was still there. Fear and uncertainty clung to her like a shadow. As the day wore on, John found it increasingly difficult to maintain normal routine. The storm had caused minor damage to the fences, and some cattle had wandered closer to the edge of the property. He worked steadily, repairing the broken fences and guiding the stray animals back into the pens. Yet, every so often he would glance toward the barn, worried about Maria. She had started exploring a little, moving cautiously among the stacks of hay and old tools, but she never strayed far. John understood that she needed space and time to adjust, yet he could not help but feel responsible for her well-being. Around midday, a sudden noise startled them both. A neighbor's horse whinnied loudly from across the fields, and John instinctively moved to check. Maria froze, her eyes wide with fear. "It's all right," John said quickly, holding up his hand. "It's just a horse. Nothing can hurt you." But he could see the tension in her shoulders. The past night had taught her that the world could be dangerous, and even simple sounds now seemed threatening. John realized that her fear was not unreasonable. She had been on her own for so long that trust had to be earned carefully, not given freely. The neighbor, a man named Samuel, arrived shortly after on horseback. He had heard about the storm and wanted to check if John's property was okay. When he saw Maria, his eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Who's this?" he asked, glancing at the young girl. "Brasp. She's someone who needed shelter last night," he said carefully. "She's safe here." Samuel nodded slowly, but there was a hint of suspicion in his eyes. John could feel the tension rising again. Even though Maria was safe, the presence of outsiders could complicate things. Throughout the day, Maria remained cautious. She followed John's movements but avoided direct interaction with Samuel or other neighbors who had come to check on the ranch. She seemed to understand instinctively that her presence could cause misunderstandings. John watched her closely, admiring her intelligence and awareness. She was a survivor, learning quickly how to navigate a world that often judged her before understanding her. Yet he could see that the constant vigilance weighed on her. Fear had become a companion, and she had not yet learned how to let it go. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, John tried to engage Maria in small tasks around the barn. He handed her a broom and asked her to sweep some of the wet hay, speaking slowly and patiently as he explained what to do. Maria watched him carefully, then began to imitate his movements. Her small hands were clumsy at first, but she persevered, sweeping the hay in careful strokes. John encouraged her gently, praising her efforts. Breeze. For a moment, she seemed to relax, smiling faintly as she completed the task. But the tension returned quickly when a sudden gust of wind rattled the barn doors. Rest. She froze again, clutching the broom like a lifeline, and John realized how deeply fear had imprinted itself in her mind.
By late afternoon, John knew he needed to address something important.
He sat near Maria on a pile of hay, trying to gauge how much she understood about her current situation.
"You're safe here," he said gently.
"No one can hurt you while you stay with me. The storm is over and the ranch is calm. You don't have to be afraid." Maria looked at him, her dark eyes cautious but searching. She nodded slightly, then whispered, I
just don't want to leave." John felt a pang of understanding.
She had survived alone for so long that the idea of trusting someone and the safety that came with it was new and frightening. The rest of the day passed with quiet observation. Fry candid whether passes by their violet shot. John tended the animals, repaired fences, and made sure the barn remained secure. Maria stayed close, sometimes helping, sometimes watching, but always alert. John realized that her trust would take time. He could not force it. He could only provide a safe space and consistent care. Rest. He reflected on the fragility of trust and the courage it took for someone to allow themselves to be vulnerable after facing so much fear and uncertainty. Evening approached, and the sky turned shades of orange and purple once more. The sun, now low on the horizon, cast long shadows across the barn and the fields beyond. John prepared a simple dinner of bread, cheese, and fresh water. Maria ate slowly, speaking only a few words, but each one carried meaning. She asked questions about the ranch, about the animals, and about the routines John followed each day. Gracious, he answered patiently, realizing that she was not just curious but trying to understand the world around her, a world she had been isolated from for too long.
As darkness fell again, the memory of the previous night's storm lingered.
Maria remained cautious, flinching at small sounds and shadows, while John continued to speak softly, offering reassurance. They had begun to understand each other, but the process was slow and delicate. Misunderstandings could happen at any moment, and both knew that patience was essential. John realized that protecting her was more than sheltering her from physical danger. It was about creating an environment where she could begin to feel safe emotionally. The quiet of the night was punctuated only by the occasional animal noises from the surrounding fields. Maria wrapped herself in the blanket, sitting near the small fire that John had kept burning. "Don't stop," she whispered again, this time referring to the fire. John smiled softly, understanding that she was beginning to trust him in small ways. The fire was warmth, safety, and consistency, all things she had lacked for so long. For John, these small moments were victories, proof that patience and understanding could bridge even the widest gaps between two very different lives. But even as trust began to grow, John knew the day had revealed how fragile it still was. One wrong word, one sudden movement, could undo all the progress they had made. He realized that the night of the storm had been just the beginning. The real struggle, the challenge of helping Maria navigate fear, misunderstanding, and the unknown, was only starting. And he understood that both of them would need to face these struggles together, learning to communicate, understand, and trust each other in a world that had not always been kind. As the fire burned low and the barn settled into quiet darkness, John looked at Maria sleeping nearby, her small chest rising and falling steadily. The day had been filled with moments of tension, misunderstanding, and small victories. He felt a deep sense of responsibility, but also a quiet hope. The struggles of the day had brought them closer in subtle ways, creating a bond that was still fragile but growing stronger with each shared moment. He realized that life on the ranch, so predictable and routine, had been forever changed by the presence of this small, frightened girl. Her arrival had disrupted his world, forcing him to confront patience, empathy, and trust in ways he had never experienced. And for Maria, the day had been another step toward understanding that not all strangers were dangerous, and that sometimes the kindness of one person could create a safe place in a world that often seemed unsafe. The morning after the long, tense day felt different. The air was fresh and crisp, carrying the scent of the plains after the storm. Birds chirped softly in the distance, and sunlight spilled across the damp earth, making the grass and the scattered puddles shimmer. For the first time since Maria had arrived at the ranch, there was a sense of calm that felt more than just the absence of danger. John Miller could feel it too. There was a subtle change in the barn, a quiet sense of possibility that had not existed before. Maria woke early, as was her habit, and looked out at the sunlight filtering through the barn walls. Proof. She had spent the previous night close to the fire, wrapped in her blanket, thinking about the storm and the events that had brought her here. Her mind was filled with questions, confusion, and memories of the challenges she had faced, but beneath the uncertainty there was also curiosity, a small, fragile hope that perhaps this place and this man could offer something different. She had survived storms, hunger, and fear before, but now she felt the beginnings of a connection she had not experienced before. John noticed her awake and approached slowly, trying not to startle her.
Good morning, he said softly.
Did you sleep well? Maria nodded slightly, her dark eyes still cautious but calm. John could see the tension of the past days easing slightly from her posture. He gestured toward the small table where he had set breakfast. Come, eat something, he encouraged. Brace. She moved slowly, taking a seat and beginning to eat, her eyes flicking to him occasionally as if testing his intentions. John understood. Trust was fragile, and she needed reassurance through every gesture and word. After breakfast, John decided it was time to speak more openly with Maria. He sat down near her, taking a deep breath. Rask, I want you to understand something, he said gently. You're safe here. Nothing can hurt you while you stay on my ranch. I will protect you, and I won't let anything happen to you. Maria looked at him with wide eyes, her lips pressed together. There was a hesitation in her gaze, a silent question about whether his words could be trusted. John realized that verbal assurances were only part of the story. He had to show her through actions that she could rely on him. He led her outside, where the sunlight warmed their skin and the smell of wet earth filled their senses. The cattle had calmed after the storm, slowly grazing in the fields, and the fences were repaired enough to keep them safe. John showed Maria how he worked with the animals, moving calmly among them, guiding them, and speaking softly so they felt secure. Maria observed closely, mimicking his gestures and learning quickly. There was a cautious determination in her movements, a desire to understand and participate rather than remain a passive observer. As they worked together, John noticed a moment of hesitation in Maria. She was trying to herd a small calf toward the pen but froze when it tried to run past her. He approached quietly, kneeling beside her.
It's all right, he said.
The calf is scared, just like you were in the storm. You don't need to push it. Take your time. Maria looked at him, then at the calf, and slowly guided it back. Her face lit up with a small, proud smile. John realized that this was more than just learning about cattle. She was learning to face fear, to trust herself, and to trust him as well. Throughout the morning, John continued to guide her patiently. Every movement, every word, was careful and deliberate. He knew that the turning point would come not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent actions that showed reliability and care. He observed her closely, noticing subtle signs of trust, how she no longer flinched at his movements, how she began to speak more freely, how her eyes followed his with interest rather than fear. These small moments were victories, though they might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. As the sun climbed higher, John decided to take a risk. He began to share a story about his own past, a rare glimpse into a life he usually kept private.
When I was a boy, he began, I had a family, a home, and everything seemed safe.
But one day, everything changed. People I trusted made choices that hurt others, and I had to learn how to survive on my own. I understand what it's like to feel alone, to not know who to trust. Maria listened intently, her eyes wide. She didn't interrupt, but John could see her relating to the words, connecting with them in a way that was quiet but profound. Then, unexpectedly, Maria spoke. Her voice was low, almost hesitant, but filled with emotion. I was alone too, she admitted. People, they hurt my family. He glances around in despair. I had nowhere to go. I didn't know who to trust. John felt a deep surge of empathy. This was the moment he had been waiting for. the first time she had shared a part of her story with him. It was fragile, and he handled it with care. "I understand," he said gently. "You can trust me here. You don't need to hide anything." For the first time since the storm, Maria allowed herself to relax fully. She moved closer to the fire sitting beside him and let her small hands rest openly rather than clutching the blanket for protection. John realized that trust had begun to form, not through words alone, but through shared experience, patience, and understanding. Breath. The storm had been a catalyst, but this day, the calm, the sunlight, the steady presence, was what truly began to change their relationship. They spent the rest of the morning talking quietly. Maria asked questions about the ranch, about the animals, and about John's life before she arrived. John answered patiently, weaving stories of the land, the seasons, and the work he had done for years. Maria listened, sometimes asking for clarification, sometimes offering her own thoughts. It was a dialogue, a tentative dance of understanding, where each action and word built the bridge of trust between them. By afternoon, John decided to take Maria on a short walk beyond the barn. He wanted her to see the world beyond the small, safe space of the barn, to understand that danger was not everywhere, and that there were places where she could feel secure.
They moved slowly, John speaking softly, pointing out familiar landmarks and explaining the land. Maria followed carefully, her eyes wide with curiosity and caution.
She had been so used to hiding and running that the idea of moving freely in daylight felt strange and exhilarating at the same time. During their walk, a small rabbit darted across the field. Maria instinctively froze, then looked at John for guidance. He smiled gently and whispered, "It's all right. It won't hurt you. It's just a rabbit." Slowly, she relaxed and watched the rabbit hop away. John realized that these small moments, simple reassurances, small gestures of calm, were more powerful than any lecture or warning. Narration. They built understanding, security, and, most importantly, trust. By evening, the light had softened, casting long golden shadows across the plains. They returned to the barn, tired but quietly triumphant. Maria moved confidently, no longer clutching the blanket in fear but carrying it loosely. John prepared dinner while she watched, occasionally asking questions and helping when she could. There was laughter now, soft and tentative, emerging naturally from the quiet bond forming between them. It was the first real laughter he had heard from her, and it carried a weight of relief and joy. As night fell, they sat near the fire together. Maria whispered again, "Don't stop." And this time, John understood immediately. She was asking him to keep the fire burning, to keep the warmth and comfort alive. He nodded, smiling softly. "It will keep burning," he said, "and so will I here with you." For the first time, Maria felt that she was not alone, not truly alone, as she had been for so long. Breath. She realized that trust could exist, that safety could be found, and that someone could care for her without expecting anything in return. The turning point was subtle but profound. The storm had tested them, fear had challenged them, but patience, empathy, and shared experience had created a breakthrough. Maria had begun to understand that not all strangers were dangerous, and John had learned that connection required more than protection. It required listening, understanding, and small, consistent actions that proved care and reliability. As the fire crackled and the barn settled into quiet darkness, both of them knew that life would never be the same. The storm had passed, but the lessons remained. Despair. Fear could be overcome with patience. Mistrust could be replaced with understanding, and even the most fragile connections could grow into something lasting if nurtured carefully. That day, John and Maria had crossed a threshold, one that would allow them to face future challenges together, strengthened by trust, respect, and a deep understanding of each other's hearts. The morning after their breakthrough was calm, yet filled with a quiet energy that neither John nor Maria had felt before. The storm had long passed, leaving the plains glistening under the first golden rays of the sun. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and grass, and the distant hills were clear against the sky. John looked out over his land, feeling a sense of peace mixed with a gentle excitement. The events of the last few days had changed everything, not just for Maria, but for him as well. Life had shifted in ways he had not anticipated, and he realized that he could not return to the quiet, predictable routine he had once valued so highly. Maria stirred from her sleep, slowly lifting her head and stretching her small arms. She had grown used to the warmth and safety of the barn, and yet she still felt a flutter of uncertainty in her chest. The world outside had been harsh, unpredictable, and often cruel. But here, with John, she had begun to feel something she had never experienced fully before: security. It was not just physical protection. It was the sense that someone cared, that she could trust another person without fear. She moved toward John quietly, still shy but with a newfound confidence that had not been there just a few days ago. John had already started preparing breakfast. The routine of the ranch still needed attention. Cattle had to be fed, fences checked, and water troughs refilled. But his movements were steadier now. He carried a small plate of bread and dried fruit to Maria, who had taken her place near the fire. "Eat," he said gently. "You need energy for the day." Maria nodded and began to eat, her dark eyes glancing up at him occasionally. There was no hesitation, no fear, only a quiet acknowledgement that he was there to support her. For John, it was a small victory, proof that the trust they had built was beginning to take root. After breakfast, John suggested they walk through the fields. He wanted Maria to see the land during the calm after the storm, to understand that not all dangers were immediate, and to feel the freedom of open space. They moved slowly, side by side, John pointing out familiar landmarks and explaining the ways he cared for the cattle in the land. Maria listened intently, absorbing everything with quiet curiosity. The wind was gentle, carrying the soft rustle of grass and the distant call of a hawk. She felt the thrill of movement, of being able to walk without fear, and she began to relax fully in the presence of someone she could trust. As they walked, John noticed the subtle changes in her behavior. She was no longer shrinking at sudden sounds or movements. Her posture was more open, and her eyes held a brightness that had not been there before. She laughed softly when a small rabbit darted past, no longer frozen in fear, and even asked questions about the animals they passed. John realized that this was the result of patience, consistency, and empathy. The turning point from fear to trust had been reached, and now Maria was beginning to embrace the possibility of hope. During their walk, John shared more of his own story, talking about his life before he had become a rancher. He spoke of his family, the hardships he had endured, and the lessons he had learned from years of solitude and hard work. Maria listened quietly, occasionally nodding or asking questions. She began to see him not just as a protector, but as a guide and a friend. The walls of mistrust and fear she had carried for so long were slowly giving way to connection and understanding. By midday, they returned to the barn, and John allowed Maria to help with small tasks she had learned over the past days. She fed the smaller animals under his guidance, swept the hay, and even helped with simple repairs.
Each task was an opportunity to build confidence, and Maria approached them with determination.
But she made mistakes, of course, but John encouraged her gently, praising her effort and guiding her patiently. The small victories accumulated, reinforcing her sense of capability and her trust in him. As the afternoon sun climbed, John and Maria sat quietly outside the barn, watching the cattle graze and the wind ripple through the fields. The world felt peaceful and ordered, yet they both knew that life was rarely without challenge. John reflected on the events of the past few days, the storm, the fear, the miscommunication, and finally, The breakthrough. He understood now that true protection went beyond keeping someone safe physically. It required patience, empathy, and the willingness to understand the world from another's perspective. Maria, too, reflected silently, realizing that safety and trust could exist even after prolonged hardship. Then, unexpectedly, Maria spoke. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Thank you," she said, looking directly at John.
For keeping me safe. For,
Listening. John felt a warmth spread through his chest. These words were small, but they carried immense weight. She was acknowledging not just the physical safety he had provided, but the emotional support and patience that had allowed her to trust again. "Rest," he smiled gently. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You've been very brave. You've learned to trust, and that is just as important as anything else." The rest of the afternoon passed with quiet conversation and small shared tasks. John taught Maria how to check the water troughs, tend to the fences, and guide the cattle. She listened carefully, asking questions and following his instructions. Each successful task brought a new spark of confidence in her eyes. She began to move with a steadiness that had been absent when she first arrived, and John could see that the trust they had built was now firmly established. The bond between them was no longer fragile. It had become a foundation they could rely on in the days to come. As evening approached, the sky turned brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple. The plains glowed with the light of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the barn and fields. John and Maria sat quietly, watching the colors shift and fade. There was a sense of completion in the air, a feeling that the difficult days and nights had led to something meaningful. The storm, the fear, and the uncertainty had all been part of a journey that had brought them together in a bond of trust, understanding, and shared experience. Dinner was quiet but comfortable. Maria ate with ease, no longer hesitant, and John felt a deep satisfaction in seeing her thrive. The fire burned steadily in the stove, casting warmth and light across the barn. Maria glanced at it and whispered, "Don't stop." John smiled, understanding perfectly this time. "It will keep burning," he said. "And I will too." The simplicity of the moment carried profound significance. It symbolized continuity, protection, and care, values that had been tested and proven over the past days. But night fell gently, and the barn settled into a quiet calm. The animals were safe. The storm was long gone, and the bond between John and Maria was stronger than ever. They sat together near the fire, sharing stories, laughter, and the occasional comfortable silence. The experiences of the past days, the storm, fear, miscommunication, and eventual trust, had all led to this moment of peace and understanding. John realized that life on the ranch would never be the same. The presence of Maria had introduced new depth, meaning, and connection into his solitary world. For Maria, the changes were equally profound. She had learned that trust could exist, that kindness could be found, and that someone could care without expecting anything in return. Birth. She no longer feared the storm outside or the unknown dangers of the world. She had discovered that safety and hope could be nurtured, and that resilience was strengthened not just through survival but through connection with another human being. She had faced fear and uncertainty, and now she faced the future with courage and confidence. As the night deepened, John and Maria reflected quietly on the journey they had shared. The storm had been a test, the miscommunication a challenge, and the struggle a lesson in patience, empathy, and understanding. They had navigated fear together, learned to trust, and discovered the profound impact of kindness and consistency. The bond they had built was now strong enough to endure the uncertainties of life on the plains. They had found safety, understanding, and companionship in one another, a rare gift in a world often marked by hardship. Before sleep, Maria rested her head near the fire, feeling warmth and security she had not known before. John watched over her quietly, filled with a sense of pride and deep satisfaction. The events of the past days had changed both of them. Breaths. He had learned that life's meaning was not in routine alone, but in connection, empathy, and the willingness to care for another. She had learned that safety, trust, and hope were possible, even after fear and hardship. The next morning promised a continuation of this new life, a life shaped by mutual respect, trust, and shared experience. They would face future challenges together, equipped not just with strength but with understanding, patience, and compassion. The storm had passed, but its lessons would remain, guiding them in ways both subtle and profound. In the quiet moments before sleep, John whispered softly, "We made it through together. And tomorrow we will face the world together too." Maria nodded slightly, her eyes heavy but filled with trust. That night, the barn was not just a shelter from the storm. It had become a place of transformation, connection, and hope. Their lives had changed forever, not because the storm had ended, but because they had faced it together, learned from it, and discovered the power of trust, patience, and empathy.